Sherlock Holmes and the Whisper at the Widow's Door. Chapter 1. The Whisper at the Widow's Door. It was in the waning days of November, when London's skies seemed content to draw a perpetual shroud over the streets, that I found myself once again at Baker Street, seated opposite my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The wind that day was not merely cold. It seemed to search for every gap in a man's clothing, creeping in like some stealthy pickpocket, robbing him of warmth. A thin drizzle tapped the windows in a manner that suggested patience rather than urgency, as though the rain intended to stay for days. Holmes, for his part, sat half-reclined in his armchair, the smoke of his long clay pipe rising in idle spirals toward the gaslight above. I'd been speaking to him of some minor matter of my practice, an elderly patient with curious delusions, when our conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Mrs. Hudson, bearing a small silver tray. Upon it lay a card, damp at the edges, its neat copper-plate hand declaring, Mrs. Lydia Armitage, widow of the late Captain Jonathan Armitage. R.N. Holmes glanced at it, one eyebrow arching almost imperceptibly. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson," he said without looking away from the window. His voice had that peculiar timbre which told me his mind was already alight with speculation. A few moments later, our visitor entered, a tall, spare woman in her early 50s, dressed in deep mourning. Her veil was lowered, though the dim light caught upon the pale oval of her face. She carried herself with the kind of quiet composure one associates with those long acquainted with personal loss. Yet there was something else, an air of unsettled vigilance, as though she were perpetually listening for a sound the rest of the world could not hear. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice low but steady, "I am told you concern yourself with matters unusual in nature. I should not trouble you with something so strange, were it not that I fear for my reason, or my life." Holmes indicated the chair nearest the hearth. "Pray be seated, Mrs. Armitage. If your matter is indeed unusual, it is all the more suited to my profession. You have my complete attention." She took her seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I live alone," she said, "in a small house in St. John's Wood. My husband died at sea 3 years ago, and since then I've had no close relations in London. The house is quiet, too quiet, some might say, but I have learned to value solitude. Until 3 nights ago." Here she paused, glancing briefly toward the door as though ensuring no one lingered there. It was close to midnight. I had extinguished my lamp and was preparing to retire when I heard it, a whisper, faint but distinct, a man's voice, speaking my name. "Lydia." Her gloved fingers tightened. It came from the other side of my front door. I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen, though he remained perfectly still. "At first," she continued, "I thought it must be some drunken passer-by, but when I went to the window, the street was empty. I returned to the door, my heart hammering, and again it spoke, the same voice, though softer, as if urging me to come nearer. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. Not even a footprint in the frost upon the step." "And this has occurred more than once?" Holmes asked quietly. "3 nights in succession, always at the same hour, always my name, and—" She hesitated. "The 3rd night, the whisper said more. It said, 'Lydia, you left the latch unfastened.'" Holmes leaned forward. "Did you, in fact, leave it unfastened?" Her gaze faltered. "I had, but I swear I had not told a soul. Nor could anyone have seen me do it from the street." "And yet—" He knew. Holmes tapped the stem of his pipe against his fingers, the faint rhythm betraying deep thought. "Mrs. Armitage, what is your opinion of the matter?" "I do not know what to think, sir. Part of me fears some stalker or criminal means me harm. Another—" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Another part wonders if it is my husband's voice. I should not say so aloud, but I knew it well in life, and it was his." Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace. You have told no one else? No one. I dared not. I came here only because I felt watched, even in daylight. Then you did well, Holmes replied. For secrecy may yet be your safeguard. Dr. Watson and I will call at your house this evening, if that is agreeable. She looked relieved. It would be a blessing, Mr. Holmes. Until then, Holmes said, keep your doors barred and your curtains drawn after dusk. Speak to no one of this matter, and his eyes met hers with sudden intensity. If you hear the whisper again before we arrive, do not, under any circumstance, open the door. When she had gone, I turned to Holmes. You believe it is a trick, then? My dear Watson, he said, resuming his seat, I believe nothing as yet, but note this. Our visitor is either the target of a most peculiar method of intimidation, or she has unwittingly stumbled into the machinery of a deeper design. Tonight, we shall see which. The rain at the window seemed to tap more insistently, as though echoing the faint knock of an unseen hand at a widow's door. Chapter 2. A quiet voice in the fog. For some minutes after Mrs. Armitage's departure, Holmes remained in his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded, yet far from idle. The crackle of the fire and the faint hiss of the rain against the panes were the only sounds in the room. At length, he rose and crossed to the window, parting the curtain slightly to peer out at the dull, slate-colored afternoon. I could not refrain from breaking the silence. Holmes, you are considering the matter as one of simple human agency, I presume. Not the supernatural, Watson. He finished for me, glancing over his shoulder with the faintest trace of amusement. If the dead have indeed returned to whisper at front doors, they have been most remiss in not consulting me sooner. No, our problem lies in flesh and blood, in the realm of human cunning. Yet there are points about it which are singular. He let the curtain fall back into place and began pacing. You refer to her claim that no footprints were visible, I suggested. Precisely. A frost-bound step, Watson, is a most uncharitable surface. It betrays the trespasser as plainly as a fresh snowfall. Either our whisperer possesses the admirable skill of walking without touching the ground, or the frost had melted by some local means before her inspection. Both possibilities are worth the candle. He halted, frowning into the fire. Then there is the question of knowledge, the unfastened latch. A trifling domestic oversight, yet known to our nocturnal caller. It suggests observation at a closer range than Mrs. Armitage suspects. I stirred in my chair, troubled by the image. You think someone has been watching her house, perhaps even inside it? I think, Holmes said slowly, that a door may be opened from without ever being touched from within, and that the mind which contrived to tell her so wishes her to be acutely aware of her vulnerability. His words set an unpleasant chill creeping up my spine, despite the blaze at the hearth. If it is intimidation, I said, to what end? She is no heiress or wealthy dowager, and her husband, being naval, would hardly have enemies lingering in London after 3 years. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, my dear fellow, you are making the cardinal error of presuming the motive before the method is known. Our first duty is to understand how the whisper is accomplished. The why will follow naturally. He moved to the mantel and consulted his watch. It is not yet 4. We shall dine early, and then make our way to St. John's Wood under cover of the evening fog. I fancy our mysterious whisperer may not be able to resist a 4th performance. The remainder of the afternoon passed in quiet preparation. Holmes took down from a shelf a small black leather case, the contents of which I recognized from previous nocturnal investigations. A compact dark lantern, a thin coil of rope, and a pair of opera glasses fitted with unusually fine lenses. As he inspected each item, his eyes held that glint of anticipation which always signaled a hunt in the offing. By 7 o'clock, the fog had thickened, drifting in long, ghostly coils along Baker Street and muffling the rattle of the occasional hansom cab. We hailed one presently, and soon were gliding northward through a city rendered dreamlike by the haze. Holmes sat back, his collar turned up, saying little. I knew better than to interrupt the workings of that agile mind when it was engaged upon a fresh puzzle. Mrs. Armitage's residence proved to be a narrow, well-kept house in a quiet terrace. The street lamps shone dimly through the mist, casting feeble halos upon the damp cobbles. She greeted us with evident relief, ushering us into a small but tastefully furnished parlor. The fire was bright, though the rest of the house lay in shadow, and I noted that the heavy curtains were already drawn, as Holmes had advised. "You have heard nothing since this morning?" Holmes asked her at once. "Nothing, Mr. Holmes, but I have felt—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Felt as though someone were just beyond the light. Even now." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "You will oblige me, Mrs. Armitage, by retiring to your upstairs room for the present. Dr. Watson and I will keep watch here until midnight." When she had gone, he crossed to the front door, examining the lock and latch with his lens. Then he stepped back, extinguished the parlor lamps, and allowed the glow of the fire to be our only illumination. "Now, Watson, we wait," he murmured. The minutes crawled by, marked only by the ticking of a mantel clock and the distant clip of a horse's hooves somewhere in the fog. I confess I found my own nerves tightening in that hushed vigil, every creak of the settling timbers seeming unnaturally loud. It was precisely at 11 minutes past midnight when it came, a faint sound from the other side of the door. Not a knock nor a footstep, but a whisper, soft as the movement of silk. "Lydia." I started involuntarily, glancing at Holmes, whose face was a mask of intense concentration. The whisper came again, no louder, but with a strange intimacy, as though the speaker's lips were almost upon the wood. "You forgot the key." Holmes' hand shot out, pressing my shoulder in silent command to remain still. He moved noiselessly to the window, parted the curtain by a hair's breadth, and peered into the street. For an instant his body stiffened. Then, just as quietly, he drew back. "Not yet, Watson," he breathed. "Our phantom voice has not finished his part. Listen." The whisper returned, repeating the words as if to someone hesitant to obey. Then, after a pause, there came the faintest rustle, followed by utter silence. Holmes straightened, the faintest glimmer of triumph in his eyes. "I have him, Watson, but for tonight we remain in the dark. Tomorrow the noose begins to tighten." I longed to press him for an explanation, but his manner made it plain that my questions would meet only with that familiar, infuriating, "all in good time." And so we sat once more in the dim parlor, the fog pressing against the windows, while somewhere beyond it moved the owner of that disquieting voice, unseen, but now no longer unsuspected. Chapter 3. The Mark Beneath the Lamp. It was a pale and reluctant dawn that greeted us when Holmes and I left Mrs. Armitage's house the following morning. The fog had thinned into shreds and tatters, clinging here and there in the hollows of the street, while the frost had returned in delicate lacework upon railings and window panes. Holmes was in high spirits, striding along with that restless energy which always accompanied the scent of a fresh clue. I, on the other hand, was still turning over in my mind the memory of that uncanny whisper, trying and failing to imagine how a human voice could be delivered with such nearness and yet leave no sign of its source. Holmes halted abruptly a few yards from the Armitage house, his keen gaze sweeping the front step and the flagstones beyond. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing with the tip of his stick. "What do you see here?" I bent over the spot he indicated. To my eyes it was merely a patch of damp stone, slightly discolored, perhaps, from the rest. "Moisture from the fog," I ventured. "Moisture, yes, but deliberate, not accidental." He produced a small glass phial from his pocket, uncorked it, and dipped a scrap of blotting paper into the wet mark. "A faint odor, Watson. Note it. Aniseed. a favorite trick among certain street performers and mountebanks, used to attract trained animals. Our whisperer has a flair for old-fashioned methods. We moved further down the pavement, Holmes stopping at intervals to crouch and inspect the ground. Presently, he directed my attention to a lamp-post some 10 yards from Mrs. Armitage's gate. "There," he said. "Do you see that faint scuff at the base?" Indeed I did. A narrow groove, fresh enough that the frost had not yet reclaimed it, curving round the iron post like the bite of a rope under strain. Holmes ran his fingers along it with evident satisfaction. This is where our friend fastened his instrument, some variety of speaking tube or flexible conduit. From that distance, with the tube's end held close to the door's keyhole, one could whisper with uncanny intimacy without ever approaching the step. The thought sent a shiver through me. Ingenious, Holmes. But why such elaborate theatrics? Why not simply knock if intimidation is the object? Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing. Because, my dear fellow, the method is the message. The effect upon Mrs. Armitage lies in the seeming impossibility of the voice. That she cannot imagine the means ensures her mind dwells on the menace. The question we must answer is, what precise end does the menace serve? Our circuit of the immediate vicinity yielded 2 further discoveries. Faint impressions in the frost along the opposite curb, suggesting the presence of a handcart or barrow, and a length of fine twine caught in the splintered edge of a wooden fence post in the adjacent alley. Holmes pocketed the twine, noting its almost invisible weave. Not common shop twine, specially prepared, strong yet inconspicuous. Our adversary is no amateur. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the city had shaken off much of its morning gloom. Holmes wasted no time in laying out our finds upon the table, examining each with meticulous care. He handled the twine as though it were a fragment of precious silk, measuring its gauge with a small caliper, while the aniseed-stained blotter was sealed in an envelope and set aside. "Watson," he said at last, "there are 3 possibilities. The first, that Mrs. Armitage is the target of a personal enemy, one who wishes to unnerve her for reasons of revenge or gain. The second, that she is a pawn in some larger scheme, and the intimidation is meant to drive her into a particular course of action. The third, and least likely, that she is the incidental victim of some performance or demonstration meant for another. Our task is to reduce these 3 to 1. "And how will you proceed?" I asked. "By learning more of Mrs. Armitage's past. A widow's life, quiet though it may appear, often conceals debts, loyalties, and obligations invisible to the casual eye. Captain Armitage's career, his acquaintances, and his estate are all open doors to inquiry." The day was spent in such inquiries. While I remained at Baker Street to receive any message from our client, Holmes vanished into the labyrinth of the Admiralty's records, the sailors' registry, and even, I suspect, the more shadowed corners of the waterfront. It was not until near dusk that he returned, his coat dusted with the grit of London's thoroughfares, his eyes alight. "Watson, we progress. Captain Armitage served with distinction, but there is a shadow in his final voyage, a court of inquiry into the loss of certain confidential charts. The matter was officially closed without blame, but I have reason to think it left bitter traces in some quarters. One name in particular recurs in the whispers of dockside taverns, a former petty officer dismissed under circumstances less than honorable." "Do you suspect this man?" I asked. Holmes smiled thinly. "I suspect everyone until they are eliminated. But this man has both the skill and, perhaps, the motive. He is known to have a talent for mechanical contrivances, an asset to any seaman and, I dare say, to any nocturnal whisperer." Before I could press him further, Mrs. Armitage's card was brought up once more. She had come, not in mourning attire this time, but in a plain dark cloak, and her expression was a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. She reported that there had been no whisper the previous night after our watch. though she confessed to having slept poorly. Holmes listened intently, then said, "We are close to unmasking our ghost, madam. Tonight you will not hear the whisper at your door. But if my calculations are correct, the man who made it will hear something himself, something that will draw him into our net." And with that he turned to me, that familiar light of imminent action in his eyes. "Watson, we shall need a coil of stout cord, a small bell, and the quietest cabman in London. Our whisperer's game is nearly played out." Chapter 4. The circle tightens. The evening that followed was one of those peculiar London nights when the air seems thick with unshed rain, and the lamps gleam like pale moons behind a veil. Holmes and I took our leave from Baker Street just after 9, our cab slipping quietly through streets half empty, save for the occasional newspaper boy or weary laborer heading home. The items Holmes had requested, a coil of cord, a small handbell, and a narrow canvas satchel, rested at his feet, their purpose unrevealed to me despite my attempts to draw it from him. He sat forward in the dim interior of the cab, his hat brim low, eyes fixed ahead, as if every turning of the wheels carried him deeper into the design he had set in motion. Mrs. Armitage greeted us at her door with the same reserved relief as before. Holmes spoke to her briefly in the hall, instructing her to remain upstairs with her lamp extinguished after 11 o'clock. She agreed without protest, though I could see her eyes wander uneasily to the shadowed corners of the room, as if she feared the whisperer might even now be waiting. Once she had retired, Holmes motioned for me to follow him outside. We crossed the street in silence and took up position in the mouth of the narrow alley that ran alongside the terrace. Here Holmes knelt, setting his satchel upon the cobbles, and drew out the coil of cord. In quick, efficient motions, he looped one end about a hitching ring set into the brickwork and tied it to the handle of the small bell. The other end he carried across to the front garden of the neighboring house, securing it in such a way that a man approaching Mrs. Armitage's step from the lamp-post would have to pass between the 2 points. A single touch of that cord in the dark would set the bell to trembling in Holmes's hand. "This," he whispered to me, "is the earliest warning we can hope for without betraying our watch. The moment the bell stirs, we move." We withdrew into the shadows, Holmes positioning himself behind the jutting corner of a garden wall, while I crouched a yard or 2 behind him. The fog had returned, swirling low along the pavement, and the lamplight diffused into pale halos that left the stretches between them in near darkness. It was in such a pocket of shadow, midway between lamp and door, that Holmes's gaze fixed itself. The hours seemed to stretch, each minute dragging on like an hour. I found myself listening so intently for the faintest jingle that every creak of a distant shutter or scuff of a rat in the gutter set my nerves on edge. Yet Holmes remained perfectly still, his breathing slow, his figure scarcely discernible against the wall. The street lay silent, but for the occasional drip of water from the eaves and the muted strike of the church bell at midnight. It was nearer to 1 o'clock when the faintest vibration stirred the cord. Holmes's hand closed upon the bell instantly, muting its sound, and his head inclined toward me in a signal to be ready. A moment later, a shape materialized in the dimness, a stooped figure moving with careful, deliberate steps along the pavement. Even in the half-light, I could make out that he wheeled a small handcart, its wooden frame muffled in rags to prevent noise. He stopped by the lamp-post, setting the cart down, and began to fumble with some unseen object. Holmes leaned close and murmured, "Note the care he takes. No ordinary prowler. That cart holds the apparatus for our whisper." From the cart, he drew a length of something flexible, like the hose of a fire pump, and affixed one end to a small brass funnel. The other end he lifted, letting it coil like a serpent in his hands as he advanced toward the house. His movements were silent, practiced. The end of the tube found the keyhole, and his lips pressed to the funnel. Though we could not hear the words from our distance, I knew that were Mrs. Armitage behind the door, they would reach her as clearly as if breathed into her ear. Holmes touched my arm, and we moved. I kept to his heels as we closed the gap between us and the figure. But before we reached him, Holmes paused, as though choosing his moment with a hunter's patience. Then, in a swift motion, he stepped from the fog, one hand seizing the man's shoulder while the other clamped over the funnel. The intruder gave a muffled cry, twisting to break free, but Holmes's grip was iron. "Steady, my good fellow," he said in a low, dangerous tone. "We would not wish the lady to hear more than she already has, would we?" I came up on the other side, ready to assist, but Holmes did not move to unmask the man or question him. Instead, he released him as suddenly as he had seized him. The fellow stumbled back, clutching the tube, his eyes darting between us. Without a word, he snatched up his cart and retreated into the mist, vanishing within moments. I was dumbfounded. "Holmes, why in heaven's name did you let him go?" "Because, Watson," Holmes replied calmly, winding the cord back into the satchel, "we have learned what we needed. We have seen the method in full, the care with which he avoids leaving prints, the apparatus that allows him to speak from a distance. But more importantly, we have told him, without a single word of accusation, that he is known. Men who work in the shadows do not take such warnings lightly. He will run to ground, or, if I am correct, he will attempt something more daring to achieve his object before we close in. And that, my dear fellow, will be his undoing." We withdrew to the cab that had been waiting at the far end of the street. Holmes gave the driver an address I did not recognize, and we rolled away through the fog, leaving the widow's house silent behind us. It was not until we were halfway across the city that he spoke again. "Our next step, Watson, is to visit an old acquaintance of mine in Limehouse, a man who deals in instruments of precision. I suspect he has recently sold a speaking apparatus to a seafaring type with more guile than scruple. If we can match our phantom's tools to his supplier, the circle will be very nearly closed." The cab rattled on into the damp night. The sound of the wheels muffled in the wet air, and I could not help but feel that, though we had touched the whisperer's shoulder, the real voice behind the widow's door had yet to speak. Chapter 5. The Man in the Workshop. The cab drew up in a narrow, ill-lit lane off the East India Dock Road, where the tang of salt and tar lingered even in the damp midnight air. A row of shuttered shop fronts stretched away into the gloom, broken only by the dim glow of a single gas lamp above a doorway marked with a small brass plate. Josiah Briggs, Instruments of Navigation and Precision Workmanship. Holmes stepped down first, scanning the street with that quick, darting glance which seemed to take in every shadow and mark upon the cobbles. I followed, drawing my coat tighter against the creeping chill. The door yielded at Holmes's knock after a short delay, revealing a lean, sharp-nosed man with a watchmaker's loop still fastened in his eye. His expression brightened faintly at the sight of Holmes. "Mr. Holmes? Didn't expect you at this hour, sir. Business, I take it?" "Of the most urgent kind, Briggs," Holmes replied, stepping inside without hesitation. "This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We come seeking a particular item, recently purchased, I believe, by a gentleman with the bearing of a sailor and the hands of a man accustomed to fine mechanical work." The interior of the shop was a cramped but orderly space, its shelves lined with sextants, compasses, barometers, and more obscure contrivances whose purposes I could only guess at. On a long bench under the window lay an array of delicate tools, gleaming in the lamplight. Briggs closed the door behind us, removing the loop from his eye. "You've a sharp memory, Mr. Holmes. A week past, there was such a fellow. Weathered face, eyes like bits of flint, moved like a man who knew the roll of a deck under his boots. He came in asking after a flexible speaking tube of some length and a small brass funnel to fit it. Paid in coin, no haggling. Said it was for a bit of theatre work, though I'd wager the sea was in him more than the stage." Holmes's smile was thin but satisfied. "And his name?" Briggs shook his head. Didn't give it. But I can tell you he left here for the Anchor and Gull on Shipwright's Row. If you ask after him there, you'll find someone who knows him. Holmes thanked him, leaving a coin on the counter. We stepped back into the night. The fog here was tinged with the acrid smoke of the dockside, and the air rang faintly with the clang of chains and the distant shouts of men unloading cargo. We walked a short way to a corner where a low building squatted against the quay, its windows throwing warm light onto the slick stones. A wooden sign, weathered and swinging, bore the name The Anchor and Gull. Inside, the tavern was thick with the smells of ale, tobacco, and wet wool. A few knots of sailors bent over their mugs, speaking in the low, guarded tones of men used to keeping their business their own. Holmes steered us to the bar, where a heavy-set landlord eyed us with mild suspicion. "A pint for me and for my friend," Holmes said easily, placing a shilling on the counter. "And perhaps you can tell me if a certain gentleman is here tonight. Medium height, stocky build, left ear nicked as if by a blade." The landlord's brow furrowed. "You'll be speaking of Timpson, I reckon. Haven't seen him this evening, but he's been in most nights of late. Keeps to himself in the back corner, him and that queer little cart of his." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And where might he lodge?" "That I couldn't say," the man replied, sliding our drinks forward. "But I know this. He's got business on the west side, for I've seen him leave here and head toward the Hackney rank on Pelham Street more than once." Holmes absorbed this with a thoughtful nod, then moved away from the bar to a small table in the corner. We sat for some time, Holmes apparently content to let the noise and smoke swirl about us while his mind arranged the facts into whatever shape they demanded. At last, he spoke in a low voice. "We are narrowing the field, Watson. Timpson, if that is indeed our whisperer, has a maritime past, access to specialized equipment, and a connection to Mrs. Armitage's quarter of the city. I will hazard a guess that his object is not merely to frighten her, but to move her, physically or otherwise, into a position advantageous to him or his employer. We must discover what that position is before he forces it." We left the tavern and hailed a cab, Holmes instructing the driver to take us back toward Baker Street. As the wheels rattled over the wet stones, he sat forward, fingers drumming lightly against his knee. "Tomorrow morning, Watson, we will pay another call on Mrs. Armitage, but this time you will keep her occupied in conversation while I examine certain features of her house that I suspect are central to this affair. There is something about her property, its location perhaps, or some hidden access, that our whisperer values enough to risk repeated visits." I asked if he believed Timpson to be working alone, but Holmes only shook his head. "That, my dear fellow, remains to be seen. But the hand that presses its lips to a speaking tube is not always the mind that gives it words. The true voice behind the whisper may yet be elsewhere, and much closer to the lady than she imagines." The cab carried us on through the silent streets, the gas lamps passing like pale sentinels in the fog. Somewhere in the city, a man with a sailor's stride and a brass funnel was preparing for his next move. And beside me, Holmes was already calculating how to turn that move to his own advantage. Chapter 6. The Wall with a Memory. The following morning broke grey and windless, the sort of day when London seems to exist under a bell jar, its sounds muted and its air heavy with a faint tang of coal smoke. Holmes and I took an early cab to St. John's Wood, the streets still damp from the night's mist. Mrs. Armitage admitted us herself, her composure a shade more settled than on our previous visits, though her eyes still flickered to the street as if expecting some shadow to detach itself from the fog. Holmes greeted her with that courteous gravity he reserved for clients of delicate sensibilities. "Dr. Watson will be so good as to sit with you a while, madam, and speak of those matters which may take your mind from recent events. Meanwhile, with your permission, I should like to examine the outside of your property. There are details which daylight renders more cooperative than darkness. She agreed readily enough, and I followed her into the parlour. We spoke for some minutes on ordinary subjects, her late husband's service, her years in Portsmouth, the small routines that made up her days in this quiet street. Yet even in these domestic recollections there was a faint edge, as though she were a woman listening for something just beyond the range of the air. Holmes's absence stretched on, but I knew better than to interrupt him. At last I heard the faint scrape of his boots on the stone path, and he appeared at the parlour door, brushing a trace of mortar dust from his sleeve. "Watson, will you join me?" he said, his tone carrying that restrained urgency which always signaled the uncovering of something significant. Outside, he led me along the side of the house to where the garden wall met the rear corner of the building. The bricks here were older than those of the main facade, their mortar a lighter shade. Holmes knelt, running his fingers along the base, and produced from his pocket a thin steel probe with which he tapped lightly at one of the lower courses. The sound was not the dull thud of solid masonry, but a hollow note, faint yet distinct. "This wall," Holmes said softly, "was not built as part of the house. Its foundations are shallow, merely a skin, Watson, and behind it there is a void. I fancy it runs the length of the property, forming a narrow passage between house and garden wall." "A smuggler's passage?" I suggested. "More likely an access route for maintenance or delivery, long since bricked over. But its existence would allow a man to stand close to the house, even to a window or door, without being visible from the street. And if the far end of the passage connects to another property, or to the mews, it might explain how our whisperer approaches and departs unseen." We walked the length of the wall, Holmes pausing at intervals to examine faint scrapes in the frost or a fragment of grit pressed into the soil. At one spot, near a drain pipe, he crouched to inspect a faint oval in the dirt. "Boot print," he murmured. "Not Mrs. Armitage's, too broad in the heel, and note the trace of salt crystals in the mud, as if the wearer had walked recently on dockside boards. Our sailor again, Watson." Returning to the front, Holmes stepped back to take in the whole facade of the house, his eyes narrowing as they travelled from the ground floor to the eaves. "You see how the upper windows are partially obscured from the street by the angle of the neighbouring building? That geometry would allow a man in the passage to watch the upper rooms without fear of being observed from the pavement. Yes, our whisperer's nocturnal theatre may be only one act in a larger play." When we rejoined Mrs. Armitage, Holmes resumed his easy courtesy, making no mention of his discoveries. "You will do me a great service, madam, if you would permit me to station a discreet watch upon your house over the next 2 nights. It may be necessary for Dr. Watson and myself to call at unusual hours, but I assure you it is entirely in your interest." She agreed without hesitation. And after a short exchange of practical arrangements, we took our leave. In the cab, Holmes was silent until we were well clear of St. John's Wood. Then he said, "We are close to the heart of the matter, Watson. This hidden passage is the artery through which our whisperer moves, but arteries have a heart to feed them. We must now determine whose interests it serves, and to do that, we must draw him into using it under our eye." "And how do you propose to accomplish that?" I asked. "By giving him cause to believe that Mrs. Armitage is about to remove something from the house, something he cannot afford to lose. We shall set the stage for him, and when the curtain rises, we shall be waiting in the wings." He leaned back then, his eyes half closed, though I knew his mind was busy with the placement of each element in his coming stratagem. For my own part, I could not shake the image of that hollow wall and the silent space behind it, a space where a man might stand unseen, his voice travelling through a length of brass and rubber to the ear of a lonely widow, weaving fear and obedience in equal measure. Chapter 7. The bait is set. The next day dawned with a brittle clarity, the fog of the previous nights burned away by a pale winter sun. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I entered, a single sheet of foolscap before him covered in his neat, angular script. He looked up only briefly to acknowledge me before folding the paper and slipping it into an envelope. "Watson," he said, "you will accompany me this morning to St. John's Wood, but our visit will not be to Mrs. Armitage. We have other ears to reach, ears that will carry what we wish them to carry." He offered no further explanation as we hailed a cab, and I have learned in our long association that his silences are often as deliberate as his utterances. We alighted in a small square a few streets from Mrs. Armitage's terrace, where a grocer, a post office, and a tobacconist occupied the corner shops. Holmes entered the grocer's first, ordering a modest assortment of goods, but pausing to remark, within easy hearing of two loitering customers, that the provisions were to be delivered to Mrs. Armitage, who was making arrangements to leave London for the coast within the week. From there we proceeded to the post office, where Holmes inquired, with a similar lack of discretion, whether any parcel might arrive for Mrs. Armitage before her departure. The postmistress, a sharp-eyed woman, replied that she had heard nothing of it, and Holmes merely nodded, allowing the seed to be planted. At the tobacconist's he purchased a small quantity of tobacco, but again contrived to mention her supposed removal. Each time I saw him mark the reactions of those present, weighing the significance of a lifted eyebrow or an exchanged glance. When we had returned to Baker Street, I could contain my curiosity no longer. "Holmes, is it not dangerous to spread such a rumor? If our whisperer hears it, will it not provoke him to some rashness?" "Precisely, Watson. A man who has gone to such lengths to intimidate will not stand idle if he believes his object about to slip beyond his reach. He will act, and we shall be there when he does. The key is to provoke without alarming. A whisperer relies on the victim's ignorance of his method. Once he suspects discovery, he will vanish. Therefore, we let him think himself still invisible while giving him cause to hasten his work." The remainder of the day passed in quiet preparation. Holmes had sent a note to Lestrade, requesting 2 plainclothes men to be stationed at discreet vantage points near Mrs. Armitage's home. He also procured from Briggs, the instrument maker, a small collapsible periscope of polished brass, which he examined with evident satisfaction. For looking into narrow, inconvenient spaces, was all the explanation he would give. By the time we returned to St. John's Wood that evening, the neighborhood seemed no different to the casual eye. But I fancied there was a slight air of anticipation about the place, as though the houses themselves were waiting for something to unfold. Mrs. Armitage received us with a composure that had grown since our first meeting, though there was still a trace of tension in the set of her mouth. Holmes, as ever, told her only what was necessary, that we might be obliged to remain in the vicinity for several hours, and that she was to retire upstairs promptly after supper, locking her bedroom door and opening it to no one until she heard my voice. Shortly after 10 o'clock, we took our positions. Holmes and I crouched in the narrow entry to the side passage he had discovered, the bricks cold against our backs. The air smelled faintly of damp mortar, and the darkness was near total. Somewhere across the street, one of Lestrade's men waited in the shadow of a lamp-post. The other, Holmes told me earlier, was concealed at the far end of the mews that might serve as our quarry's escape. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the occasional gust rattling a loose shutter or the distant clop of a late cab horse. Then, without warning, Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. Faintly, from the direction of the street, came the muffled sound of small wheels turning over the stones. We both leaned forward, peering through the narrow opening. Out of the darkness emerged the same stooped figure we had seen before, pushing his handcart, though now his movements were quicker, more purposeful. He paused only briefly by the lamp-post before moving directly to the rear corner of Mrs. Armitage's property. There he crouched, placing something upon the ground, an object I could not clearly make out in the gloom, and began to work at the base of the garden wall. Holmes drew the small periscope from his coat and angled it toward the narrow seam between two bricks. Through it, he studied the man's actions for a full minute before withdrawing and whispering in my ear. "He is loosening a false section, small enough to pass an object through. There is more here than fright, Watson. There is retrieval." We held our breath as the man reached into the aperture he had made, his arm vanishing almost to the elbow. When he withdrew it, his hand clutched something wrapped in oilcloth, which he placed carefully into the cart. At that instant, Holmes gave a short, sharp whistle. The two plainclothes men moved in from their posts, converging on the figure, but the man was quick, quicker than I would have thought possible. Abandoning his cart, he slipped through a narrow gap in the fence and vanished into the mews with the constables in pursuit. Holmes was after them in a heartbeat, and I followed, my boots striking sparks from the cobbles. We turned into the mews in time to see a dark shape vault over a low gate and disappear into the shadows beyond. The pursuit ended there. The maze of backyards and alleys swallowed our quarry as neatly as a stone dropped into deep water. Holmes stood still for a moment. His breathing only slightly quickened, then turned back toward the house. "He will run, Watson," he said, "but he has left us his cart, and whatever prize he came to take. That will speak for him, perhaps more eloquently than he would for himself." Back at the property, Holmes crouched over the abandoned cart and unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside was a small metal-bound chest, no larger than a man's hat box, its lock heavily corroded but intact. He regarded it for a moment in silence, then covered it again. "Not here," he murmured. "We shall see to its contents in Baker Street, but I think, Watson, that we have at last touched the true nerve of this affair." And as we left St. John's Wood behind in the deepening night, I could not help but feel that whatever lay inside that small weathered chest would prove far more dangerous than any whisper at a widow's door. Chapter 8. The chest on the table. It was close to 2 in the morning when we reached Baker Street once more. The streets almost deserted save for the occasional flicker of a constable's lantern or the distant rumble of a market cart bound for Covent Garden. Mrs. Hudson, long accustomed to Holmes's irregular hours, had left a lamp burning low in the sitting room, its circle of light falling across the worn carpet and the familiar clutter of our shared domain. Holmes placed the small metal-bound chest upon the center table, brushing away a thin smear of damp from its corroded surface. For a long moment, he regarded it in silence, his head slightly inclined as though listening for some faint inner ticking. Then, without a word, he fetched from the cupboard a slender set of lock picks and set to work at the rusted clasp. The metal yielded reluctantly, the corroded tumblers groaning in protest before clicking open with a sound almost too loud in the hush of the room. When the lid came up, the smell of salt and age drifted out, a briny tang, as if the box had spent years at sea. Inside lay a bundle of folded oilskin, tied about with twine. Holmes untied it with care, revealing a packet of documents, their edges yellowed and curling. He spread them upon the table one by one, his long fingers moving with a collector's delicacy. The first sheets were nautical charts, hand-drawn and meticulously annotated in a precise, almost obsessive script. I leaned closer, noting the sweep of coastlines I did not recognize, studded with soundings, currents, and small cryptic symbols. "These are not Admiralty issue," I said. "Indeed not," Holmes replied, his eyes scanning the lines. "Private charts, compiled for purposes one would not wish to enter in the log. Note here," he tapped a small mark in the margin, "a ciphered note, doubtless indicating a rendezvous point. And here, a set of bearings that lead to something of value, I would hazard, though whether lawful or otherwise remains to be seen." Beneath the charts lay a thinner packet of correspondence. Holmes opened the first letter, and I caught sight of the date, 3 years prior, in the final months of Captain Armitage's last voyage. The writing was bold, almost aggressive in its sweep. You will have your payment when the delivery is made. Not before. The cargo is not for the official manifest, and I need not remind you of the consequences should word of it reach the wrong quarter. Holmes's lips tightened. Our late captain, it seems, was not entirely free of entanglements. These letters speak of a transaction conducted outside the reach of maritime law, perhaps smuggling, perhaps espionage. The identity of the correspondent, however. He turned to the signature, only to find it represented by a looping initial M and nothing more. One by one he examined the remaining documents, his expression deepening into that faraway concentration which told me his mind was already mapping the invisible threads between what lay before us and the events at Mrs. Armitage's door. At last he sat back, steepling his fingers. Watson, we may set aside the notion that our whisperer acts solely out of some personal grudge or mere mischief. These papers, particularly the charts, represent information of value, and to certain parties of very great value indeed. If Captain Armitage concealed them here, it suggests he feared their seizure by others, that they have now been sought, and so methodically, tells us the searcher is either an agent of the original owner or one who intends to sell them. And Timpson, I asked, the man with the speaking tube? An operative, skilled, but not the guiding intelligence. His role was to soften Mrs. Armitage's nerves, to compel her either to abandon the house or to leave it open to entry. But mark this, he did not attempt to search the house at random. He went directly to the wall, to a concealed aperture known only to someone familiar with the property. Which means, my dear fellow, that our unseen mastermind has knowledge of the house's history, perhaps even a connection to it. Holmes rose then, pacing the length of the room with his hands clasped behind his back. The question now becomes, who is our M? For once we answer that, the rest will arrange itself. These charts will tell us where to look, but I suspect we need only follow the whisperer's trail to find him. He stopped abruptly, his head turning toward the window. For a moment, I thought I too had heard it, a faint scuff of something against the sill. Holmes crossed swiftly to the casement, flinging it open to peer into the darkness. The street below lay empty, the lamplight pooling weakly on wet cobbles. When he returned to the table, his expression was unreadable. We are observed, Watson. Whether by Timpson or by another, I cannot yet say. But it confirms what I already suspected, that the attempt tonight was not the end of the matter. We have taken the bait they sought to recover. That makes us the next target. I glanced at the open chest, the scattered papers, and felt an involuntary shiver. Then we must guard them carefully. Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes were bright. On the contrary, my dear Watson, we must make it appear that we have left them unguarded. And with that cryptic pronouncement, he began methodically replacing the documents in the oilskin, tying the twine with the same knot in which we had found it, and setting the chest once more in the middle of the table, like a lure placed just so in the current, awaiting the fish bold enough to strike. Chapter 9. The watcher in the street. By the time daylight crept through the curtains of Baker Street the next morning, Holmes was already at work. The chest sat upon the table exactly as we had left it, but I noticed that a faint smear of chalk now marked the rim of its lid. And a fine thread, so thin it was nearly invisible, stretched from the clasp to the arm of Holmes's chair. He caught my glance and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "A signal, Watson," he explained, "to inform me if our nocturnal visitor chooses to pay an uninvited call during our absence. It will break with the slightest pressure, and the chalk will tell me if the lid is lifted, even so far as a hair's breadth." Our absence, it seemed, was to be deliberate. Holmes announced over breakfast that we would spend the greater part of the day abroad, in full view of the neighborhood, ensuring that whoever watched us would believe the flat unattended. He moved with a brisk, almost jaunty precision, though I could see the sharp focus in his eyes. The game, as he would say, was afoot. We walked a meandering course through London that morning, taking in the bustle of the markets, the press of cabs on the Strand, and the hum of business along Cheapside. Yet at intervals, Holmes would pause, seemingly to admire a display or inspect a news bill, but always angling his head in a manner that let him scan the street behind us. Twice he remarked upon the same solitary figure, a man of middling height, in a dark overcoat and soft felt hat, keeping just far enough back to blend with the throng. By midday, Holmes had confirmed my own growing suspicion. "Our friend is patient," he said as we strolled past St. Paul's. "He has shadowed us since we left Baker Street, but without once drawing nearer than 30 paces. That is the mark of a professional, neither eager nor careless." We took luncheon at a small establishment in Fleet Street, where Holmes positioned himself by the window. Through the shifting veil of passers-by, I caught sight of the man again, loitering at a bookseller's stall with exaggerated disinterest. Holmes pretended not to see him, turning the conversation instead to the docks, to Captain Armitage's last voyage, and to the mysterious M whose identity still eluded us. When at last we returned to Baker Street, the winter dusk was already descending, the lamps flaring one by one along the wet pavements. Holmes unlocked the door with apparent nonchalance, but his eyes flicked at once to the chest. Without touching it, he bent to examine the chalk mark and the thread. Both were undisturbed. "No intrusion today," he said, removing his coat. "Our watcher is cautious. He will wait for the hours when the street thins and his movements draw less notice. Tonight, Watson, we shall oblige him." After a simple supper, Holmes set about darkening the sitting room save for a single shaded lamp in the far corner, leaving the chest prominently upon the table. He then drew the curtains so that a narrow gap remained, just enough to permit a view of the street without being seen. From this vantage, we kept our silent vigil, the hours marked by the slow ticking of the mantel clock. It was close upon midnight when Holmes gave a slight motion of his hand. A figure had detached itself from the shadow opposite, crossing the street with a fluid swiftness that spoke of experience. The man carried no lantern, but the faint gleam of a key in his hand caught the lamplight. He approached the front door as one entirely sure of his purpose. Holmes's gaze was fixed, but he made no move to intercept. "Not yet," he murmured. "We must see how far he is willing to go." From our place behind the curtain, we heard the soft click of the lock. No forced entry, but the work of a man with the right key. The door closed behind him, and moments later there came the faintest creak from the stair. The sitting-room door eased open, letting in a draught that stirred the lamp flame. The man stepped inside. His face was partly shadowed by his hat, but I recognized the set of his shoulders. It was not Timpson. This was someone else entirely, taller and leaner, his movements those of a man accustomed to command. He went straight to the chest, bending over it with the ease of one who knew exactly what he sought. As his fingers touched the clasp, the fine thread parted with a whisper, and the chalk mark smudged under his hand. That was Holmes's cue. In an instant, the gas flared up, and Holmes stepped forward from the gloom, his voice cutting through the air. "That will suffice, sir. I believe the contents of that chest are not yours to take." The intruder froze, then straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing. There was no fear in his face, only calculation. "You have the advantage of me, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and steady. "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and I should like to retain it. Kindly remove your hat and take a seat. Dr. Watson, if you would be so good as to lock the door." I did so, my revolver close at hand. The man seated himself without protest, though his gaze flicked once toward the window, as if measuring the chances of escape. In the brighter light, I saw a long, narrow scar running from his temple to the line of his jaw, and eyes of a pale, almost colorless gray. Holmes regarded him with the faintest trace of a smile. "We have not met before, but I have been expecting you. You have the look of one who prefers to work through others." Men like Timson, for example. Yet tonight, you came yourself. That suggests the matter at hand is too valuable to entrust to an intermediary." The man's lips curved, though not in amusement. "You are well informed, but information can be a dangerous possession, Mr. Holmes. More dangerous, perhaps, than you imagine." "Possibly," Holmes allowed, "but it can also be most enlightening. And you, sir, are about to enlighten me considerably." The two men regarded each other in silence for a long moment, and I sensed that some unspoken challenge had passed between them. Outside, the street lay silent, the gas lamps burning steadily. Inside, the air was taut as a drawn wire. The game was no longer one of whispers at a widow's door. It had moved into the open, and the adversary was seated not 20 feet from us. Chapter 10. A name in the shadows. Holmes remained standing, one hand lightly resting on the back of his chair, his gaze fixed on the man before us, with that curious mixture of detachment and penetration which could so unsettle the strongest constitution. The scar-faced visitor met it without flinching, his pale eyes steady. But there was a stillness to him, a coiled quality, like a fencer poised to parry. "You came with a key," Holmes began, his voice measured and quiet, "which means you did not expect to be interrupted. You approached without a lantern, which means you know this street well enough to avoid its faults. And you went directly to the chest, without so much as glancing around, which means you have prior knowledge of its presence and its contents. Would you care to correct me if I am wrong?" The man's lips curved faintly. "I have nothing to correct, Mr. Holmes, except perhaps your assumption that my interest is in theft. That chest contains something which does not belong to you, nor to the lady in St. John's Wood. I am here to recover it on behalf of its rightful owner." "And who would that be?" Holmes inquired. "That," the man said, "is a matter of trust, and you and I, sir, have no such arrangement." Holmes's eyes narrowed, though his tone did not change. "No, but we may yet have an arrangement based on necessity. You see, you are in a parlor in Baker Street at 1 o'clock in the morning, in possession of a key that does not belong to you, having attempted to take a chest connected to a matter of serious criminal interest. If I were to summon Inspector Lestrade, who is not far away, you might find your options reduced to one, to speak freely in the dock." For the first time, the man's composure wavered. He leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming once against the arm of the chair. "Lestrade, you say? Scotland Yard has no more to gain from this than I do, but if I give you a name, will you hear the rest before you act?" Holmes inclined his head. "I will hear it." The man's pale eyes held his for a moment, then he said, "Merrick." Holmes gave no outward sign, but I knew that name meant something to him. He began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Captain Elias Merrick, formerly of His Majesty's Navy, cashiered for conduct unbecoming, later a trader along the West African coast. Am I warm?" "You are exact," the man said. "Merrick is the one who commissioned those charts from Captain Armitage. They mark certain coves, certain channels, where a vessel can put in without attracting attention. Places known to very few. Places that are valuable to men in our line of work." "And your line of work?" Holmes asked softly. The man's smile returned, thin and humorless. "Let us call it facilitating the movement of goods, legal or otherwise. Armitage was paid to deliver the charts to Merrick on his return voyage. But the captain died at sea and the charts vanished. Merrick has been seeking them ever since, for reasons you may well guess. The Whisperer was our attempt to secure them without attracting the wrong sort of noise." Holmes stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on the man. "And Timson? His part?" "A capable fellow," the man said, "but given to improvisation. The Whisper was my idea, but he took a certain relish in it. Fear can be a more precise instrument than force, and Mrs. Armitage seemed the type to heed a voice in the night more than a knock at the door." I felt a surge of anger at his casual tone, but Holmes remained impassive. Why not simply purchase the house or negotiate directly with Mrs. Armitage? Because, the man replied, we suspected she did not know she possessed anything of value. To reveal our interest would have been to drive up the cost, or to bring in others whose interference would be inconvenient. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then said, "And now?" The man's shoulders shifted in a small shrug. "Now I have told you enough for you to understand that my business is not with you but with Merrick. I'm his agent in this, nothing more. If you wish to keep the charts, then you should know that Merrick will not be dissuaded by failure here. He will come himself, and when he does, there will be more than whispers at a widow's door." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the faint hiss of the lamp. Holmes moved to the window and glanced briefly at the street before turning back. "You have a choice. Leave here without the chest, and I may forget we met tonight. Or remain, and I will see you delivered to the yard before dawn. Which is it to be?" The man rose, his movements smooth and unhurried. "You are a difficult adversary, Mr. Holmes. I will leave you your prize, for now, but remember the name Merrick. You will hear it again." Without another word, he allowed me to unlock the door and stepped into the cold night. We watched from the window as his figure melted into the shadows until even the sound of his footsteps was gone. Holmes turned back to the table, his eyes on the closed chest. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have just been paid the courtesy of a warning by a man who would have slit our throats had it suited him. Merrick is the mind behind this, and Timson merely a hand. The question is, what lies within these charts that makes them worth such theatre? That is the question we must answer before Merrick himself steps onto the stage." He sank into his chair, fingers steepled, the lamplight drawing sharp lines across his face. Outside, Baker Street lay silent, but I could not shake the sense that somewhere in that darkness, the game's next move was already being prepared. Chapter 11. The Shadow of Merrick. The following day brought with it a hard, dry cold, the sort of air that sets the skin tingling and sharpens every sound in the street. Holmes was in no humor for lingering over breakfast. Before Mrs. Hudson had cleared the plates, he had swept the charts and letters back into the chest, locked it, and placed it in the corner beneath the violin case, as though to remind himself that its value was in what it could lead to, rather than in what it contained. "Merrick Watson," he said, as we stepped out into the brittle morning, "is not a man one finds in the society columns or in the Gazette. He belongs to the strata that moves between legality and crime with the ease of a shark in both fresh and salt water. To catch him, we must learn his present station, his known haunts, and, most telling, those who will speak his name with more caution than contempt." Our first call was at the Admiralty, where Holmes, by means of a card and a quiet word to an old contact, was granted a few minutes with the duty archivist. I watched as he leafed through the service records, his eye darting over the columns until it lit upon a line that seemed to interest him. "Discharged, 1889, from command of the Resolute," Holmes murmured. "No court-martial, but conduct unbecoming. Naval shorthand for some indiscretion the service prefers to forget. Prior stations along the West African coast, and before that, the Caribbean." He closed the ledger softly, thanking the man, and we took our leave. From Whitehall we crossed the river and made our way into the narrow lanes of the docklands, where the air was heavy with the smell of rope tar and the cries of gulls wheeling overhead. Here, Holmes's method altered. He became less the gentleman inquiring, and more the shadow among shadows, speaking in low tones to a cooper outside his shop, slipping a coin to a boy who darted off into a maze of alleyways, leaning for several minutes on the rail outside a tavern without ever crossing its threshold. Each encounter added another thread to the net he was weaving. By noon, we found ourselves in the taproom of the Seafarer's Rest, a place whose grimy windows looked out upon the slow churn of the river. Holmes took the darkest table, from which he could command a view of both door and bar. Presently, a man of thick-set build and sunburnt complexion entered, glancing about before seating himself opposite us. There was no introduction. Holmes merely slid a folded slip of paper across the table, upon which I saw only the word Merrick written in Holmes' hand. The man's eyes flickered to it, then back to Holmes. "You've got a dangerous curiosity," he said in a voice like gravel. "Merrick doesn't much care for being sought." Holmes's smile was slight. "I imagine not. But he has been seeking something himself, and that search has brought him within a few streets of my own door. I should like to know where he stands now, and with whom." The man took a pull from his mug, as if weighing the price of an answer. "Word is, Merrick's in from the coast. Docked quiet like 2 weeks ago aboard the Sea Witch. Keeps to a warehouse on Rotherhithe, where the watch don't ask questions. He's got men, 6 at least, loyal enough to kill for him. Your friend Timpson was seen there last month, carrying some sort of case." Holmes inclined his head, committing the information to memory. "And his trade?" "Whatever pays," the man said flatly. "Guns, maps, gold, flesh. It's all the same to Merrick. But lately he's been after something particular. Some say it's a route through the reefs on the west coast, a way to bring in cargo without any eyes on it. Others say it's about what's hidden at the end of that route." Holmes pressed no further, instead leaving a coin on the table and rising. Once we were outside in the thin sunlight, he said quietly, "The warehouse will be our next point of inquiry, but we must tread carefully. A direct approach would send him to ground before we could so much as catch a glimpse. We will need a vantage point, a place from which to watch without being seen." The afternoon was spent in reconnoitering the neighborhood around the warehouse. It stood near the river's edge, a squat, weather-darkened building with a row of shuttered windows and a heavy sliding door. From an abandoned loft across the narrow quay, Holmes found a position that offered a partial view of the entrance, though it was too far for us to hear anything within. We observed for nearly an hour. 2 men came and went, both armed, one carrying a crate stamped with foreign markings. A third stood guard for a time at the door, scanning the street with the wary look of a man expecting trouble. Merrick himself did not appear, but Holmes seemed satisfied nonetheless. As the light began to fade, we made our way back toward the main road. "There is a rhythm to such places, Watson," Holmes said. "Men come and go at certain hours. Certain loads are moved in the dark rather than the day. If we can learn that rhythm, we can move unseen through the spaces between it. Tomorrow we will return, not as ourselves, but as men Merrick would think beneath his notice." I asked whether he believed Merrick already aware of our interest. Holmes' expression grew distant. "I suspect he knows more than we should like, but not yet enough to act with certainty. That ignorance is our window, and it will not remain open long." Back in Baker Street, as we warmed ourselves by the fire, Holmes took the chest from its corner and set it on the table once more. He opened it, not to examine the charts again, but to study the letters, reading each one slowly, as if searching for some subtle connection. At last he tapped a finger on one, dated only days before Captain Armitage's last sailing. "Note the phrasing here, Watson. The channel remains as it was in '85, but the headland has shifted. That suggests recent knowledge, not a memory from years past. Whoever wrote this was in those waters not long before the captain. Merrick may not be the only man alive who knows what these charts point to. And that," I said, "means more than one pursuer." Holmes nodded, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "Exactly. And if 2 hounds are on the trail, the wiser course may be to let them run each other to ground, while we wait where the prize must pass." Outside, the city was settling into night, but inside our rooms the air seemed charged, as if the shadow of Merrick himself had crossed the threshold. The chest sat closed between us, its contents silent, yet it seemed to me we could both hear the faint rustle of those charts. like the whisper of some distant tide pulling us toward a shore we could not yet see. Chapter 12. Faces in the fog. It was still dark when Holmes roused me, his lean figure already dressed in the rough attire of a dock laborer. The garments hung loose on his frame, the coarse wool smelling faintly of tar and rope. A ragged cap shadowed his eyes, and his hands bore the grime of coal dust, a disguise so complete that, had I not watched him assemble it, I might have taken him for the very sort of man who loitered at the quays for day work. He tossed me a similar bundle, and within minutes I too was transformed, my medical collar exchanged for a patched coat and a neckcloth of indeterminate colour. We took no cab, instead walking the 3 miles to Rotherhithe by back streets, keeping to the narrow lanes where the gas lamps were few and the cobbles slick with the night's frost. The river smell reached us before we saw the water, a mingling of salt, smoke, and the faint reek of fish from the morning's catch. By the time the first pale light crept over the rooftops, we were already within sight of Merrick's warehouse. Holmes led me to the abandoned loft he had noted the day before. We gained entry by a side door whose lock yielded with surprising ease to his hand, and soon we were crouched behind a warped shutter, looking down on the quay. Below, the warehouse stood silent, its windows shuttered, the boards weather-black and slick from the mist. For an hour, there was no movement save for the slow ripple of the tide against the pilings. Then, just as the church bells in the distance marked 7, the heavy door slid back and a man emerged, pulling a small cart behind him. He was followed by another, who carried a bundle wrapped in canvas. Holmes's eyes narrowed, tracking the men as they crossed the quay and disappeared into a side alley. "They are making a delivery," he murmured. Note how the second man kept the bundle close, as though it were delicate or valuable. By 7:30, the quay had come alive. 2 more men arrived, one carrying a sack that clinked faintly, the other holding a ledger in which he made brief, sharp notations. There was a sense of practiced economy in their movements. No word was spoken that was not necessary, and each man's task seemed clearly defined. It was close to 8 when a figure stepped out into the grey light, who drew Holmes's full attention. He was tall, with the build of a man hardened by years at sea, his hair cropped short, his beard close trimmed. Even from our distance, there was an authority in his stance, a quiet ownership of the space around him. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Merrick," he said softly. The man stood at the edge of the quay for some minutes, speaking with the one who held the ledger. His gestures were precise, economical, and the others listened without interruption. When he turned toward the warehouse door, Holmes caught my sleeve. "Watch how he carries himself. This is a man who commands through certainty, not bluster." The scar-faced intruder was right. Merrick will not be dissuaded by failure. If anything, it will have sharpened his resolve. Merrick vanished inside, and the work resumed. For the next hour, we watched the ebb and flow of men and goods. Crates with foreign stenciling, barrels that sloshed faintly when moved, long bundles that could have been anything from rolled canvas to rifles. Holmes's eyes missed nothing, yet he made no move to leave until the quay began to empty, and the men withdrew for what seemed to be a midday pause. We slipped from the loft and made our way around the rear of the warehouse, keeping close to the brick wall. Here, a narrow passage ran between the warehouse and the next building, choked with discarded rope, broken pallets, and the carcass of an old skiff. Holmes crouched by a small grate set low in the wall. "Listen," he said. From within came the faint scrape of metal on wood, followed by a murmur of voices. The words were indistinct, but one phrase reached us clearly. "Before the tide turns." Holmes's eyes flicked to mine. "Whatever is to happen will happen with the tide, Watson. That gives us a measure of their timing." We withdrew before we could be discovered, circling back to the quay where the traffic of the day had resumed. Holmes spent several minutes in conversation with a fishmonger whose stall stood at the edge of the market. purchasing nothing but gleaning from the man the fact that Merrick's men sometimes loaded cargo under cover of darkness, taking advantage of the high tide to slip away unseen. By the time we returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon, Holmes's mind was already weaving the details into a pattern. He set about marking the chart we had recovered, tracing with a pencil the routes most likely to match the tide schedules and the direction of the currents. "Watson," he said, leaning over the map, "these markings, combined with what we overheard, point to a departure tonight, or very soon after. Merrick will not risk lingering now that he knows the charts are no longer in his keeping. If he intends to use them, it must be quickly." "And you propose to stop him?" I asked. "To stop him, to see where he leads us, and, if possible, to learn what lies at the end of the course Captain Armitage charted. But it will require patience and a willingness to follow without yet confronting." That evening, the fog returned, curling in from the river and muffling the lamps along Baker Street. Holmes was at the window, watching the street below with the stillness of a hunting cat. Somewhere beyond the mist, in the darkness along the quay, Merrick's men would be moving. And when they did, Holmes intended to be not far behind. Chapter 13. The quay at midnight. The fog thickened as night deepened, wrapping the city in a damp shroud that blurred the gas lamps into pale orbs and muffled the sound of passing wheels. Holmes and I left Baker Street shortly after 10, our attire once again that of working men, the sort who might linger along the docks without attracting more than a passing glance. In his coat pocket, Holmes carried a small field glass and a notebook. In mine rested the revolver that had served us on more than one hazardous occasion. We kept to the quieter streets as we made our way east, the sound of the river growing louder with each turning. Somewhere a tug's whistle moaned, its note low and mournful, before fading into the mist. By the time we reached Rotherhithe, the tide was on the rise, licking at the green-stained pilings with a restless urgency. The air smelled strongly of salt and wet timber. Holmes led me to the same abandoned loft we had used before, its warped shutters granting a view of the quay. The warehouse below loomed in the mist, a blacker shape against the grey. For a long while there was no movement, only the slow shifting of the river and the occasional groan of a rope against its mooring. Then, faintly, came the rattle of a cart upon cobblestones. 2 men emerged from the fog, each bearing the end of a long crate between them. They crossed the quay in silence, disappearing through the warehouse door. Moments later they reappeared, this time with smaller packages, each wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes' glass tracked them closely. "Note the handling," they murmured. "Careful, deliberate. Contents that must neither be shaken nor wetted. That rules out common cargo." More men joined them, until 6 were moving in steady rotation, ferrying items from within the warehouse to a narrow gangway that sloped down to the water's edge. Through the fog, I could just make out the low, shadowy shape of a vessel moored there, its outline obscured but its mast faintly visible against the sky. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, their boots thudding softly on the boards, the only sound in that muffled world. Holmes lowered the glass. A schooner, lightly rigged and small enough to slip into coves where a larger ship could not. She is being loaded for swift passage, not for comfort. Merrick is wasting no time. We watched as a final object was brought forth from the warehouse, a chest larger than the one we had recovered, bound with iron and carried between 4 men. They moved slowly down the gangway, disappearing into the vessel's shadow. When they returned, Merrick himself was with them. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the purposeful set of his shoulders or the quick survey he cast over the quay. Holmes's attention sharpened. He will not sail without ensuring the way is clear. Watch him now. Merrick spoke briefly to one of his men, who vanished into the mist toward the street. Moments later, a whistle sounded. 3 short notes, low and deliberate. The crew responded instantly, the gangway drawn back, the lines cast off in smooth succession. The vessel eased away from the quay, the tide taking her with deceptive gentleness before her sails caught the faint wind. Holmes' eyes followed her until the fog swallowed mast and hull alike. She will follow the channel eastward for a time, then turn south with the tide. We cannot overtake her from here without a craft of our own. We descended from the loft, keeping to the shadows until we reached a smaller pier a quarter-mile downstream. Holmes approached a weather-beaten figure mending nets under a lamp, speaking to him in the low, assured tone that always seemed to produce results. Within minutes, we were in a small rowing boat, the oarsmen pulling us silently into the channel. The mist closed in around us, and for a while the only sound was the rhythmic creak of the oarlocks and the soft dip of the blades into the water. Then, far ahead, a dim light flickered, a lantern swinging briefly before vanishing again. Holmes signaled the oarsman to slow, his head tilted as he listened. "She is there," he said quietly, running without full lights to avoid notice. "We shall keep to her wake until we know her course." For nearly an hour we followed, the faint slap of her hull against the tide just audible through the fog. Twice she altered course, and each time Holmes' pencil moved over the small chart he carried, marking her position against the bearings he had calculated from the recovered maps. At last, she steadied on a southerly heading. Holmes leaned close. "She is bound for one of 3 possible coves along the coast. All are marked on Armitage's charts, and all are unsuitable for honest trade." We turned back before the tide could sweep us too far, leaving the schooner to fade into the distance. The oarsman brought us to shore, and we made our way through the sleeping streets toward Baker Street once more. The fog had thinned by the time we arrived, but the air inside our rooms felt warmer than I had expected, as though the night's chill had only sharpened the sense of purpose that now hung between us. Holmes set his chart upon the table, the pencil marks standing out in sharp relief. "Watson, the game is drawing to its close. We now have Merrick's course, his vessel, and his destination narrowed to 3 points. If we can reach one before he does, or arrive unseen before his cargo is moved, we may learn not only what these charts conceal, but why they were worth whispers in the dark and the risk of the gallows." He poured 2 measures of brandy and raised his glass slightly. "To the tide. My dear fellow, it waits for no man, but tonight it has told us more than any informer could." Chapter 14. 3 points on the map. Morning came with a clear sky, the first in several days, and a pale winter light poured across the cluttered table at Baker Street. Holmes had risen before me, his chair drawn close to the chart we had recovered from the chest, the compass and ruler set neatly at his elbow. 3 points were marked in sharp pencil along the southern coast, each accompanied by a string of bearings and tidal notes in Captain Armitage's hand. Beside them lay Holmes's own annotations from the previous night's pursuit, the lines converging like threads in a net. He glanced up as I entered, the faintest spark of satisfaction in his grey eyes. "Watson, the tide gives much away to those who listen. Of the 3 coves marked here, only one aligns with Merrick's present course and the hours of last night's departure. The others would require either a headwind or an unfavorable tide, conditions no cautious mariner would risk with such a cargo." I bent over the map, following his finger as it rested on the smallest of the 3 marks. "Port Hallow Cove," he read aloud. "A narrow inlet, steep on both sides, with a shingle beach only visible at low water. The approach is hidden until the final half-mile. Admiralty records call it unsuitable for commerce, which makes it ideal for the sort of commerce Merrick practices." "And how do you propose we reach it before him?" I asked. "That," Holmes said, leaning back, "will require both haste and indirection. We cannot match his schooner for speed on open water, but we can use the rail to place ourselves inland of his landing point and arrive by the cliff path before he comes ashore. That will allow us to observe his dealings and, if fortune favors, to intervene. The rest of the morning was consumed with preparation. Holmes dispatched a brief telegram to Lestrade, the contents of which he did not share, and arranged for a small satchel containing his field glass, a length of stout cord, and a notebook. By midday, we were aboard the Plymouth Express, the carriages swaying as the city fell away behind us, and the winter countryside opened before our eyes. Fields glazed with frost, hedgerows bare against the pale sky. Holmes was silent for most of the journey, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, though I knew his mind was pacing the cliff paths of Port Hallow already. Only once did he speak, and then it was with a curious detachment. You may recall, Watson, that Merrick's name is not unknown in certain colonial offices. It has been attached to ventures that began as trade and ended as piracy. Men of his stamp rarely risk themselves in the field unless the prize is singular. Whatever waits at Port Hallow is worth more to him than the sum of the cargo. We reached the small coastal station in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind a bank of cloud. The air carried the clean bite of the sea, mingled with the faint scent of kelp. Holmes led the way through a winding lane that rose steadily toward the cliffs, the crunch of frost underfoot our only accompaniment. At the crest, the land dropped sharply away, revealing the steel-gray sweep of the channel, restless under the gathering wind. From our vantage point, we could see the curve of Port Hallow Cove below, its shingle beach hidden beneath the tide, its flanking cliffs casting deep shadows over the narrow entrance. Holmes studied it through the glass, noting the swell and the line of white water where the tide met the outer rocks. He will not attempt the approach until the tide falls another foot, he murmured. That gives us perhaps 2 hours. Long enough to find a place from which we can see without being seen. We followed the cliff path until it descended to a ledge halfway down the face, sheltered by an overhang of rock. From here, we commanded a view of the cove's entrance and the water beyond. Holmes settled himself with the glass, his coat pulled tight against the wind, while I scanned the horizon for any sign of Merrick's vessel. The first hour passed in cold, watchful silence. Then, as the light began to fade into the blue-gray of early evening, a darker shape emerged from the east, its sails reduced to little more than slivers against the sky. Holmes adjusted the focus of the glass. There she is, Watson, the schooner, running light just as before. The vessel approached slowly, the captain clearly measuring his course against the swell and the narrowing gap between the headlands. At last, she slipped into the shadow of the cliffs, vanishing from sight for a moment before reappearing in the sheltered water of the cove. We could just make out figures moving on her deck, preparing the longboat. Holmes' voice was low, but certain. Merrick is aboard. This is his hand upon the wheel, not another's. He will land personally to oversee whatever is to be done here. We watched as the longboat was lowered, carrying 6 men and several heavy bundles toward the shore. They landed on the shingle, now exposed by the falling tide. 2 men remaining with the boat, while the others carried the bundles toward a dark opening at the base of the cliff. Holmes's attention fixed on that opening. A sea cave, Watson? Armitage's chart marks it, though without note of what lies within. If it is merely a store, Merrick could have sent his men alone. That he comes himself suggests something more. Indeed, as we looked on, Merrick himself stepped from the longboat, his figure unmistakable even at this distance. He spoke briefly to one of the men, then led the way into the cave, the others following with their burdens. The tide continued to fall, revealing more of the entrance until it stood like a gaping mouth in the cliffside. Holmes lowered the glass and turned to me, his expression set. We will not have a better chance than this to learn what the charts conceal. Once the tide turns, the cave will be closed to us. Come, Watson. We must make our way down before Merrick returns to his ship. As we began the descent toward the cove, the wind freshened, carrying with it the distant echo of voices from within the cave. The sound seemed to hang in the air, mingling with the wash of the sea against the stones, and I felt the prickle of anticipation along my spine. Whatever awaited us in that shadowed hollow was the heart of the matter, the thing for which a widow had been whispered to in the night, for which men had crossed oceans, and for which Merrick had risked the gallows. Holmes glanced back at me once, his eyes bright in the fading light. "Steady now, Watson. We are stepping into the very center of the web." Chapter 15. The Hollow in the Cliff. The descent was steep and treacherous, the narrow path cut into the rock worn smooth by centuries of wind and salt. The cry of gulls echoed above us, and the air grew cooler as we neared the waterline. Holmes moved with that quiet economy of motion which in him signaled both caution and anticipation, pausing once to glance at the cove where Merrick's long boat lay beached. Two men remained there, silhouettes against the shifting water, their posture watchful. We kept to the shadow of the cliff until the tide's hiss against the shingle masked the sound of our steps. At the base of the cliff, the entrance to the cave yawned before us, a dark arch framed by weed-slick rock. The air that issued from it was damp and faintly metallic, tinged with the smell of old stone and something else, an acrid trace I could not place. From within came the murmur of voices, their words lost in the echoing chamber. Holmes motioned for silence and led the way along the fringe of exposed rock, our boots leaving no mark upon the slick surface. We entered the cave's mouth and were at once enveloped in shadow, the dim light of evening dwindling to a muted glow on the wet walls. The sound of dripping water mingled with the low rumble of the sea outside, and somewhere deeper in the hollow the voices grew clearer. We advanced slowly, keeping close to the wall, until a bend in the passage brought the scene into view. The chamber beyond was broad and high-roofed, lit by the yellow glow of two oil lamps set on crates. Merrick stood near the center, his greatcoat thrown back, speaking in low tones to a man who was bent over a long, narrow object wrapped in sailcloth. Around them, Merrick's men moved with practiced ease, stacking smaller packages into a recess in the wall and securing them beneath a canvas sheet. The air was heavy with the smell I had noticed earlier, oil mixed with the sharper tang of saltpeter. Holmes's eyes flicked over the scene, noting every detail. "Arms, Watson," he whispered so softly I barely caught the word. "This is no mere contraband. These are rifles, and from their make, likely destined for hands that will not use them under any lawful banner." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach as I watched Merrick inspect the long object, nodding once before it was carried to the recess and hidden with the rest. When he turned to speak to his men, his voice carried more clearly. "We move them inland before dawn. The buyer will not wait." Holmes's hand tightened briefly on my sleeve, a signal to withdraw. We retreated to the bend, the murmur of voices fading as we edged back toward the mouth of the cave. Once outside, Holmes glanced toward the cove. The two guards still lingered by the long boat, one smoking, the other idly tossing pebbles into the tide. "We have our answer," Holmes murmured. The charts were not merely maps of coastlines. They were the key to this landing, known to few enough to make it a perfect point for such traffic. Merrick has been using it as a covert port for the delivery of arms, and Mrs. Armitage's late husband, knowingly or not, carried the means to find it. We began the climb back up the path, keeping low and moving quickly to avoid being seen from below. The light was failing fast, and the wind had risen, bringing with it the first hiss of the returning tide. By the time we reached the crest, the cove was already half in shadow, the cave's entrance narrowing as the water crept higher. From our vantage point, we could see Merrick and his men emerging one by one, carrying their burdens to the longboat. They moved with the unhurried precision of men who had done this before, pausing only to secure the cargo before shoving off toward the schooner, now anchored just beyond the headland. The vessel's lanterns flickered in the wind, and within minutes she was underway, her sails ghosting pale against the deepening sky. Holmes stood watching until the schooner had vanished into the gathering dark. "He will think himself unobserved," he said quietly. That is well. We must now decide whether to let the yard descend upon him at the point of delivery, or whether to follow him further and learn the full extent of his network. We turned inland along the cliff path, the cold air biting at our faces. Holmes's stride was brisk, his eyes fixed ahead as though already seeing the next move in the game. "This, Watson," he said after a long silence, "has ceased to be a matter of whispers and stolen papers. We are now dealing with a trade whose effects will be felt far beyond the shores of this cove. The law will have its due, but first we must know the buyer's name." By the time we reached the small inn in the village above the cliffs, the lamps were lit and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the air. Holmes secured us a room and a modest supper, but his mind was elsewhere. Over the simple fare, he unfolded the chart once more, his finger tracing a line from Port Hallow along the coast and inland by a winding track. "Merrick cannot carry such cargo far by sea without drawing notice," he reasoned aloud. "He will land it here, as we have seen, and then move it overland to a place where it can be dispersed. That place will be our key. Tomorrow, Watson, we begin to follow the trail from shore to storehouse." The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did little to ease the tension in the air. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and I thought of the dark cave, the oil-lit chamber, and the cold gleam in Merrick's eyes. The game had indeed moved beyond whispers at a widow's door. It now ran along the dangerous edge of gunmetal and shadow, and I could not shake the feeling that before it ended, the tide might yet turn against us. Chapter 16. The road through the heath. We were on the move before first light, the village still sunk in the heavy silence of a winter dawn. Holmes had already settled our account with the innkeeper and left word that we might return in the evening, though I suspected he had little intention of doing so unless fortune turned. The air was sharp, the frost crisp beneath our boots as we descended toward the cliffs once more. A pale wash of color was just touching the eastern sky, but the sea remained a flat sheet of pewter under the fading stars. The cove lay empty now. The tide had risen to cover the shingle, hiding all trace of the night's activity. Holmes scanned the scene briefly before turning inland along a narrow cart track that wound away between the gorse-covered slopes. "He cannot move such weight by hand," he said as we walked. "There will be wagons or carts concealed somewhere near the cliffs. Merrick would not risk a landing without having the means to carry his cargo immediately." We had not gone far before the track widened and bore the signs of recent use. The ruts in the frozen earth were deep and fresh, their edges still crumbling where iron wheels had pressed into them. Holmes crouched to examine them, his fingers brushing the soil. "2 carts," he said, laden heavily. "They passed within the last few hours, heading inland. The draft marks are sharp, which suggests well-fed horses, likely hired from a source that asks no questions." We followed the track as it rose onto a stretch of heathland, the gorse whispering faintly in the breeze. The air was brightening now, and the frost sparkled along the edges of the firs. At intervals, Holmes paused to scan the horizon, his eyes narrowing whenever the track dipped from sight. Presently, we came to a low ridge, from which we could see a line of dark shapes moving slowly across the open ground a mile ahead. Through my field glass, I made out 2 wagons, each drawn by a pair of sturdy horses, with 3 mounted men riding alongside. Holmes' expression tightened. "Merrick is not with them. He will have taken a different route, perhaps to oversee the destination's readiness. These are his carriers, and their pace tells me they are bound for somewhere not more than a few hours away." We kept to the higher ground, parallel to the road, using the folds of the heath to mask our movements. From time to time, the wind carried to us the faint jingle of harness, or the creak of wood under strain. The morning sun rose higher, though its warmth did not reach us, and by mid-morning the track began to angle downward into a shallow valley. Here the gorse gave way to patches of woodland, bare branches lacing the pale sky. From the shelter of a copse, we watched as the wagons halted briefly near a narrow stone bridge. One of the riders dismounted to check the straps securing the tarpaulins over the cargo, while another rode ahead to scan the road. Holmes's eyes took in every detail. "Military caution, Watson. They expect interference, though perhaps not of our kind. Note how the rider ahead keeps to the verges, looking for fresh prints or sign of obstruction." When the convoy moved on, we followed at a distance, crossing the bridge only when they had vanished beyond the next bend. The track now skirted the edge of a hamlet, little more than a cluster of cottages and a smithy, where a few curious faces watched the wagons pass, but asked no questions. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Fear or complicity? Either will serve Merrick's purposes. Beyond the hamlet, the road began to climb again, winding between hedgerows that gave brief cover. We quickened our pace when the sound of the wagon's wheels faded, fearing we might lose them in the turns. At the crest, the view opened onto a broad stretch of heathland broken by a single, squat building of stone, its roof patched with weathered slate. Smoke drifted from its chimney, and beside it stood a stable large enough to hold the teams. The wagons were already there, the riders dismounting and leading the horses inside. Holmes motioned for us to drop low among the gorse. "That," he said softly, "is no farmstead. The windows are narrow slits, the door heavy oak, built to withstand more than weather. If I am not mistaken, we have found Merrick's inland store." We watched as the men unloaded the first wagon, carrying the bundles through the doorway and vanishing into the shadowed interior. No word was spoken louder than necessary. And the work was swift. Within 20 minutes, both wagons stood empty, the horses watered and rubbed down. One rider mounted again and set off at a gallop along a track leading eastward. Holmes's gaze followed him until he disappeared into the distance. "He goes to make contact," Holmes murmured. "Likely with the buyer, or with Merrick himself. If we follow him now, we risk losing sight of the storehouse. If we remain, we may learn more of the defenses. But we will have no chance to trace the next link in the chain." For a moment he weighed the options in silence, the cold wind tugging at the brim of his cap. Then his decision was made. "We stay, Watson. The heart of Merrick's operation lies here, and once we know its measure, the yard can strike. Our scar-faced acquaintance may have warned us of Merrick's persistence, but I fancy he omitted to mention just how deep his foundations run." We shifted to a vantage point that allowed us to watch the building without drawing notice, settling into the lee of a low rise. The hours passed slowly, the winter sun casting long shadows across the heath. Twice more we saw movement at the storehouse, men emerging to stack crates in the yard before carrying them inside again, as though in preparation for a larger transfer. Each time Holmes noted the number of men, their positions, and the intervals between their movements with a precision that made me suspect he was already calculating the best approach for a police raid. By late afternoon, the light had begun to fade. Holmes stirred, brushing the frost from his sleeve. "That is enough for today, Watson. We must withdraw before the light fails completely and risk betraying our position. Tonight we return to the village and send a message to Lestrade. If he moves swiftly, the yard can be here by dawn." As we retraced our steps along the heath, the wind rose, carrying with it the smell of smoke from the storehouse chimney. I could not help but glance back, the squat stone building crouched against the darkening sky like some watchful beast. The road ahead would take us away from it for now, but I knew as well as Holmes that before long we would return, and that when we did, it would not be as silent watchers in the gorse. Chapter 17. A Change in the Wind. We reached the village inn under a sky bruised with the last light of day, the frost crunching underfoot, and the air thick with the scent of wood smoke. Holmes wasted no time in securing a corner table in the tap room, well away from the fire where the regular patrons sat in easy conversation. He ordered nothing but tea, though the innkeeper gave us a puzzled look, and as soon as she retreated, he drew a sheet of paper from his pocket. "This," he said, speaking low, "must reach Lestrade before midnight. The storehouse is ready to be struck. Its numbers, its layout, even the rhythm of its sentries favor a swift operation. If he moves from London on the early train with a small detachment, they could be in place by dawn. He wrote with quick, decisive strokes, the nib scratching faintly against the paper, then sealed the note and slid it across to me. See that this is delivered to the telegraph office without delay. Use the back lane. I would prefer it not be common knowledge in the tap room that messages are passing to Scotland Yard. I did as instructed, the night air biting at my face as I made my way to the low brick building that housed the village telegraph. A single clerk was on duty, his head bent over a ledger, and I handed him the envelope with a brief instruction to send it in full at once. His eyes flickered over the address, but he made no comment, merely nodding and turning to the key. When I returned to the inn, I found Holmes leaning back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the door. "You took longer than I expected," he said softly. "Our movements are watched. A man left by the front not 5 minutes after you, and though I did not see his face clearly, I recognized the coat. It was one of Merrick's guards from the Cove. The news was unwelcome, though hardly unexpected." "Then Merrick knows we are here?" Holmes shook his head. "Not necessarily. The guard may only suspect an interest. But if he carries word to Merrick, the storehouse could be emptied before Lestrade arrives. That, Watson, is why we may not have until dawn." He rose abruptly, tossing a few coins on the table, and led the way upstairs to our small room. There he unpacked the satchel, laying out his field glass, a pair of dark lanterns, and the length of cord. "If they mean to move the cargo tonight, we must see it. Better still, we must learn where it is bound. The yard will be far better served intercepting it in transit than seizing an empty building." Within 20 minutes, we were back on the road, the frost hardening under our boots as the cold deepened. The moon had risen pale and thin behind a veil of cloud, lending just enough light to outline the hedgerows and the frozen ruts of the track. Holmes set a swift pace, and before long, we had crossed the heath and reached the rise overlooking the storehouse. It looked much as it had earlier, save for the faint glow seeping from the shuttered windows and a fresh plume of smoke from the chimney. Holmes crouched, glass in hand, and studied the yard. "2 men outside," he murmured. "But the stable doors are open and the horses harnessed. They are preparing to move." We slipped down into the shadow of a hedgerow and edged closer, until we could see into the yard itself. The wagons we had seen earlier were being loaded once more. The crates and bundles passed quickly from hand to hand. The work was silent, save for the dull thud of wood on wood and the occasional snort of a horse. "Merrick is not here," Holmes whispered, his breath faint in the cold air. "But the man directing them, the one with the lantern, he will know the destination." I followed his gaze to a broad-shouldered figure in a short coat, his face half hidden in the shifting light. He moved with authority, checking the lashings and speaking briefly to the drivers. When the first wagon was ready, he swung into the saddle of his own mount and gestured sharply toward the road. Holmes touched my arm. "We follow. Keep to the verge and stay down when the ground is open." The convoy moved out, the creak of the wheels fading into the darkness. We kept well back, slipping from hedge to hollow as the road wound eastward. From time to time, the light from the leader's lantern bobbed in the distance, and the sound of hooves reached us faintly on the frozen air. After nearly an hour, the road dipped into a narrow lane flanked by high banks, and we lost sight of the lantern altogether. Holmes quickened his pace, his boots soundless on the frost. When we reached the crest beyond, the view opened onto a cluster of low buildings set back from the road, their windows dark. The wagons were already turning into the yard of the largest, a long barn with double doors standing open. Holmes pulled me into the shadow of a gatepost. "This is no random farm," he murmured. "Note the lack of light, the silence. No dogs, no livestock. A shell used only for storage." We watched as the last of the cargo was carried inside, the doors shut behind it. The leader dismounted and entered, the lantern's glow briefly spilling out before vanishing. Holmes' eyes glinted in the dark. "We have them between two traps, Watson. Lestrade at the storehouse if he moves swiftly, and ourselves here if they depart before first light. But one thing still eludes us: the buyer's identity. Without that, Merrick's capture is a victory only in part." He fell silent, his gaze fixed on the dark outline of the barn. Somewhere beyond those walls, the next move in the game was being prepared, and I could sense in Holmes the strain of calculation, the weighing of risk against the knowledge that hesitation might cost us everything. The wind shifted then, carrying with it the distant roll of the sea and, fainter still, the clink of metal from within the barn. Holmes' hand closed briefly on my arm. "They are repacking. That means a change of transport. Likely smaller carts, easier to move without drawing notice. If we can follow one, we may yet be led to the man who stands behind Merrick." The cold night seemed to grow sharper as we settled into the shadows to wait, the frost biting through my coat, the silence broken only by the far-off creak of timbers. It was clear the game had entered its most delicate phase, and that the smallest misstep could scatter the pieces before the board was set. Chapter 18. The Man Behind the Whisper. The wait was a long one. The cold seemed to creep through the very stones of the gatepost where we crouched, numbing my fingers and setting a dull ache in my knees. Holmes, as ever, showed no sign of discomfort. He might have been carved from the frost itself, his eyes fixed on the barn doors as though willing them to move. At last, there came a muted stir from within. A thin beam of light knifed across the yard as one door swung open, revealing the figure of the broad-shouldered overseer we had seen earlier. Behind him, men carried out smaller crates, loading them onto two light carts drawn by single horses. Each cart was covered with a tarpaulin, lashed down tight. The drivers exchanged a few words in low tones, then mounted, the wheels crunching softly over the frozen ground as they turned away from the barn. Holmes let the first cart gain some distance before rising from our hiding place. "We take the rear one, Watson. Quietly now. There is no need for haste so long as we keep them in sight." We followed at a steady pace, using the hedgerows and the dark hollows between fields to mask our presence. The moon, pale and high, cast a silver wash over the landscape, and in its light I could see the driver's hunched silhouette, the occasional flicker of breath from the horse. The road wound eastward, narrower now, the frost glittering in its ruts. After half an hour, the cart turned up a lane flanked by high walls and came to a halt before a tall, ivy-clad house set back from the road. Its windows glowed faintly, and the smoke from its chimneys told of a fire within. Two men emerged from the shadows of the gate, their dress markedly different from Merrick's rough crew. Heavy coats of fine cut, boots polished to a dull sheen. One of them spoke briefly to the driver, then motioned for the cart to be brought inside. Holmes drew me back into the deeper shadow of the wall, his breath warm in the cold air. "There, Watson, is our buyer's lair. And if I am not mistaken—" He paused, peering over the gate as the driver dismounted and stepped into the light. "Yes, there he is." The man who appeared next was not Merrick, nor any of the seafaring sort. He was tall, well-dressed, with a silvered beard and a manner that bespoke long habit of command. But there was something in his face, a narrowness of the eyes, a set to the mouth, that I recognized from the letters in the chest. Holmes's voice was low and certain. "Merrick's M. Watson, Colonel Sebastian Mortlake, formerly of Her Majesty's colonial forces, disgraced for unauthorized dealings in arms 15 years ago. Now, it seems, returned to his old trade." We watched as Mortlake examined the crate beneath the tarpaulin, prizing open the lid to reveal the oiled gleam of rifle barrels. He smiled faintly, spoke a few words to the overseer, and gestured for the cart to be unloaded into the house. Holmes touched my sleeve. "We have seen enough. Lestrade has the storehouse. We will give him Mortlake as the head of the Serpent. Come, there is a telegraph office in the next town, and we have work to do before dawn." It was 2 days later, back in the familiar warmth of Baker Street, that Holmes recounted to me the final moves. Lestrade's men had descended upon the storehouse at first light, seizing the remainder of the cargo and several of Merrick's crew. Merrick himself had been taken at sea that same morning by a police cutter alerted through Admiralty channels. Mortlake, confronted with the evidence from both ends of the chain, had been arrested without a struggle, his long career in shadowed dealings brought to an unceremonious end. Mrs. Armitage, for her part, had received back her peace of mind. Holmes had visited her personally, returning the chest and explaining, though in terms more delicate than complete, how its contents had drawn the wrong eyes to her door. She had thanked him with quiet dignity, though I saw in her expression the lingering echo of those nights when the whisper had come. Holmes, standing at the window that afternoon, regarded the thin sunlight on the street with something between satisfaction and abstraction. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how small a thing, a whisper in the night, can lead one down a path to such a breadth of enterprise. From a voice at a widow's door to the dismantling of an international arms ring. The chain of cause and consequence is the most inexorable of all forces." "You never believed it was mere intimidation," I observed. "Not for an instant," he replied, his lips curling in that slight smile of his. "Fear is a tool, but it is rarely an end. In this case, it was merely the opening move of a game that Mortlake thought he could play unseen. He erred in underestimating the power of the smallest clue, and the persistence of those who follow it." He turned from the window, reaching for his violin. "The case is closed, the tide has turned, and the guns will rust in the yard's storerooms. Now, Watson, let us return to more harmonious matters. I believe a little Sarasate is in order." And so the whisper at the widow's door faded into the annals of our shared adventures, another thread in the long tapestry of Holmes's work. Subtle in its beginnings, far-reaching in its consequences, and, as always, illuminated by the relentless light of his peculiar genius.